Okay, well, welcome to the second lecture of this first year course in the evolution and ecology of life. And in this lecture, I want to introduce you to some of the basic ideas of macroevolution. Now, macroevolution, as a shorthand, you can think of as being evolution at and above the species level. So we're not as interested in variation within species now. We're interested in the origin of species and higher taxonomic groups above that, families, orders, phyla, and so on. And because this is about basic ideas, the things to look out for in this lecture are references to the basic underlying ideas of how we go about understanding variation in organisms and the diversity of life on Earth as we understand it as biologists. So concentrate very much on those basic underlying ideas. Just to remind you of what we're trying to explain, we want to understand patterns of diversity in species in space, and that's shown by this first slide using the example of avian species richness. So this is species richness of birds across the surface of the Earth. The red patches being areas of very high diversity, then grading down to the darker bluer patches where there's less diversity. And that's the kind of thing we want to understand. We want to understand that sort of pattern, so the variation of species and higher taxonomic groups in space. And also, and this is perhaps more important for today when we're talking about evolutionary changes, we want to understand the variation in the patterns of the diversity of life over time as well. And that's shown as an example on this second slide, which is the number of marine families over time. And it's important to realize that this graph is older on the left. So if you look at the x-axis, then the old part is down at the origin around 600 million years ago, and the present day is right up there on the right-hand side at 0 million years ago. And the numbers of marine families does not stay constant over time. There's variation in it. And we want to understand that pattern as well. So we want to understand variation in space and patterns of variation in time. And we have a number of questions that run throughout the course, and those are, how can we derive these patterns, first of all, from the data that we have available? What are the methods we use to derive them? And once we've got them, how can we explain and understand what we see in those patterns? Then can we use those insights to understand both the present and the future, and in terms of evolution, the past as well? And what are the implications of that? And throughout this process, you need to begin thinking like scientists. And a scientist would approach all of this information with what I would call positive skepticism. They would say, I don't believe what you're telling me. I want to know how you know that, and I want to see the evidence. So throughout all of what I'm going to be saying today, throughout the whole of the course, throughout the whole of your scientific career, you want to develop this positive skepticism. How do you know that? I want to see the evidence. I want to know why you are telling me what you're telling me. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about these patterns in time, macroevolution, this change in diversity over time. And we have to start with some assumptions. We have to start somewhere. And we make some very basic assumptions. First of all, that there is an objective reality. Now, it's possible to argue a philosophical viewpoint that there is not an objective reality, but that doesn't really get you very far. You need to start with the assumption that there is an objective reality. There is a reality out there that we can access. We also need to assume that it is understandable by humans, at least up to a certain level. If we can't understand it, then there really isn't a lot of point in doing any science. We also have to assume that the laws of physics and chemistry apply to living matter. So there's nothing special about living matter. There's no what used to be called the vital spark in 19th century biology. We have to assume that everything can be understood essentially through the application of physics and chemistry to living matter. And we make a final assumption which holds most of the time, not always, but it is very useful, and that's that simple explanations are more likely than complicated ones. So where you have several different explanations for something, and one of them is extremely complicated and involves lots of different things, all of which are very unlikely and complicated, and you have a very simple one, then it's usually the simple one which is more likely to be true. And you may have heard of that called Occam's razor, and it's also called the principle of parsimony, or the principle of simplicity. And it's used a lot in evolutionary biology. We start with an overall working hypothesis. And our overall working hypothesis is that there is a naturalistic explanation for life on Earth. So we don't need to bring in any kind of supernatural explanation. It is entirely naturalistic. And it's our hypothesis, so it's an idea which may or may not be supported by the evidence, but it is supported to the extent that we're able to develop a logical, internally consistent explanation, and more importantly, that is supported by the available evidence, and it is something we can use to predict. And that's what makes it science, that it is supported by the evidence, and we can use it to make predictions that we can go and test. We are aided in this process of developing this working hypothesis by a single major underlying idea. And this idea comes from this chap, Charles Darwin, who I'm sure is familiar to you. And his major underlying idea is that what we see as life on Earth is the result of descent with modification from a common ancestor. What does that mean? Well, it means that, as shown in this schematic diagram, that species change over time and that later species are derived from earlier species. So as you go from left to right in the bottom part of this slide, species are changing over time, and the more recent species, those on the right, are derived from the earlier ones, the ones on the left. It means also that species can branch. There are branching points on this diagram, and the branches are derived from common ancestors. So the species on the two different branches are both derived from a single common ancestor. And this implies that the Earth and life are both old, because this is a very slow-acting process, and it also implies that all living forms are in some way related. They are all derived from a single common ancestor. That's contrasted with the extreme opposite explanation of special creation, where species do not change over time. They are created and they are then unchanging. So each species then is separately created. There's no connection between any of the species, none of this modification with descent, and this can allow for the Earth and life to be young. There's no need for a very long process to be involved here. Looked at another way, you can summarize Darwin's idea of descent with modification using this sort of diagram, where there's a common ancestor of all derived species. So time is now changing from the bottom to the top, so it's older at the bottom, getting increasingly young towards the top to the present. At the base of this tree we have a common ancestor, and then all derived species are related to that. They all derive from that single common ancestor. They're different, that's where the modification comes in, but they are all derived from this common ancestor. And we see that in our present understanding of life on Earth. So this is a very general tree of life. This is life as we understand it at the moment. We are up there at the top amongst the animals, our nearest relations being the fungi. And we understand all of these different branches of life as being derived from a single common ancestor. And so Darwin's main underlying idea is there as a basis to this sort of understanding that we have of life on Earth at present. Now you should be asking, well, why do we think this is likely? Why do we think a single origin is likely? You should question that. I do not believe. I want to know the evidence. Well, we think a single origin is likely because at a very basic level, all organisms are very similar. Their biochemistry is very similar, their physiology is very similar, and more closely related organisms, or what we believe are more closely related organisms, tend to be more similar. And many of those similarities appear to be entirely arbitrary. There's no obvious reason for them. For example, at a biochemical level, all organisms use what are called L amino acids. There are two types of amino acids, L amino acids and D amino acids. And all organisms use L amino acids. There's no obvious reason why they should, unless they are all derived from a single common ancestor, and the common ancestor just happens to use L amino acids. And so in the rest of this lecture, I'm going to be answering the question, how can we infer this tree? And this is an important dichotomy in thinking about science and understanding information. There are two ways of understanding scientific information, through inference or deduction. And inference involves working from the available evidence upwards towards an explanation. Deduction involves going the other way, working from a basic idea and working down to the details of what you might observe. And this tree of life and the ideas that underpin it is a product of inference. It's inferred from looking at the evidence and working up to an explanation, not starting with a large idea and then working down. So to summarize where we got to so far, what we're interested in is the patterns of biological diversity in both space and time. And in particular in this lecture, what we're interested in is the variation in time, so how species and larger taxonomic groups change over time. We're interested in how we understand that and what insights that gives us for understanding biology in the past, the present and the future. And I've suggested that you develop this, what I've called positive skepticism, whenever you're presented with this sort of information, to ask, well, how do you know that and what is the evidence? And exactly the type of process that Charles Darwin himself went through to come up with his groundbreaking ideas. We have this working hypothesis that we've got a naturalistic explanation for what we see, and tied in with that is Darwin's main idea that what we see in biology is the result of descent with modification. And that implies that the similarities we see between organisms are due to the fact that they are related, derived from a common ancestor, and we feel that's a good explanation for what we see because there is similarity between organisms. A lot of it's very arbitrary, and it does appear to fit what we observe in nature.